This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode, where I'm chatting with George Fredenham, aka Flavour Fred, chef, forager, fermenter, and former co-owner of the Foragers at the Verulam Arms in St Albans. Known for turning hedgerow finds into award-winning dishes and wild cocktails, George now runs foraging walks, woodland feasts and fermentation workshops, blending deep ecological knowledge with a flair for flavour. We talk about his journey with wild food and how he's teaching others to find, cook and preserve the edible abundance all around them.
My name is Flavour Fred. That's what I go by. I go by Flavour Fred because I'm essentially very much interested in the history of flavour and how people used to survive. So tying things together through foraging for ingredients, fermentation to sort of survive the winter. And just, obviously fungi and all those lovely things about going out and finding wild food kind of is part of that. So yeah, that's really what I'm interested in. I currently nowadays, I run courses, educational sessions, cooking sessions, fermentation sessions around the southeast, always with a big twist in terms of sort of wild flavors and how you can make interesting things you wouldn't expect out of them. So yeah, I've got a bit of a passion for trying to demonstrate that there are wonderful, intriguing flavors that you may not associate with the British countryside in and around every single green space and woodland that you can get to. So that's really what I'm all about. I got into it quite early on. I think, as with most people, I've got fond memories of, picking blackberries and even like candying the stems of Angelica. My nan had a sweet shop in a place called Shaw, not far from Rochdale. So every couple of months we'd go and see her. And I was very young, but I think making things was part and parcel of going to see her. And I come from a family that is all very keen growers and gardeners. So I've grown up digging asparagus beds, painting sheds and picking through and just sort of, doing as much as I can with everything that's around me, basically. So that's really where it all kind of happened. I weirdly didn't really start anything to do with Flavour Fred or the Foragers, which was my previous business, a pub restaurant in St Albans, until my late 20s, 28 years old. And prior to that, I don't tell people what I did. It's a well-kept secret.
Oh, that sounds intriguing. Next time I see you, I'm going to be like, what did you do before?
No, it's not a secret. I did a degree in corporate IT. I had no idea what I was doing in my life. And somehow I randomly did this degree in corporate IT and had a very brief career in London, which I soon found myself decompressing by going to the woods and, finding flavors and stuff. And that 5 years was enough for me to figure out I was doing the wrong thing, and I lent into it. So
amen to that. So did anyone teach you how to forage?
I guess my nan and my dad have been pretty integral in what I learned early on. Admittedly, it was pretty simple stuff. My dad's definitely much more a sort of gardener than a forager, but he grew up being told about mushrooms and plants, and I think that kind of filtered into some of the things that I was told. So I think like my very initial knowledge was sort of gained growing up, but actually for the most part I would say where I'm at now is all self-taught. Various books and websites and other foragers and other courses and things like that is where I've spent my time. But there's nothing like throwing yourself into something to learn it. So that's what I did when I had the restaurant. It was a baptism of fire to start with, but it's all come together quite nicely recently.
And you said about foods for survival and surviving the winter. And I think a lot of people, as you said, in the UK, there will be unexpected flavours that people don't realise are out there. And probably a lot of the time think actually they're not worth bothering with, because if it's abundant in the landscape and we're not already eating it, there must be a reason. But you take these natural flavours and you do something quite spectacular with them. And so they are palatable. I guess maybe the two of those things don't necessarily compute. So you've got survival food and food that tastes really good. Is it a question of how you treat something that gives it that?
I think the survival stuff for me is a little bit more leaning into the sort of the fermentation and processes to preserve things. So, historically before refrigeration and things like that, using salt and using methods to make sauerkraut or wherever you are in the world, kimchi. Every culture has some form of preserving food through fermentation. So, it's an interesting topic. There definitely is, what you would classify as sort of like famine foods and certain plants that I can find and gather if I wanted to. But frankly, I believe with the correct approach to preserve, you can actually find yourself in a pretty decent spot with nice flavors. Yeah, based upon what you found and grown, generally is how I like to think of it.
So when you started the restaurant, you did it obviously through the name. The foraging aspect of it was a big part. Did you actually launch it with the idea, I'm going to use a lot of stuff that is foraged?
Yeah, we did. So basically, the pub was called the Verulam Arms. It's in a city called St Albans. It's in the Cathedral Quarter, so it's about 10 minutes away from a private estate called Gorenbury, where I was lucky enough to be allowed to gather from the surrounding farmlands, hedgerows. And yeah, our intention was completely to try and demonstrate how to use wild food, and not just like a mere garnish like you'll often see in many restaurants, like delicately placing a wild leaf on something just to have the word foraged on the menu was often what you'd see. So we kind of went at it on an opposite sort of angle in the fact that we were kind of thinking about sort of hunting and gathering as part of foraging. So, we had huge amounts of things on the menu that everyone knows, like to start with, it was always sort of, nettles and fruits. We opened it in actually towards the end of the year. So we also had like game, mainly rough game on the menu as well, because obviously the farmlands and things like that would be controlling those. But yeah, it was always sort of a focus on how to actually put the wild flavors at the forefront on the dishes. I mean, obviously, if we were 100% wild, it would be quite a challenging thing. No oil, without sort of pressing it yourselves. I'm not going to go and rake some salt. So, it was always sort of a 30% wild dishes or drinks is how we like to focus on it, where we would then do specials that would be as close to fully wild as possible. And that's where we'd have to use like animal fats and other things like that to cook with. But yeah, it was certainly an interesting outlook. And I wasn't really a chef by any means. I was just intrigued and fascinated by flavor. So we had a very good chef start with us. And about 3 years in after he left, I basically had another baptism of fire, learning how to cook in a commercial kitchen, which was, pretty challenging, especially that first night. But
yeah, I can imagine. So were there any things that you served up to people where they kind of universally went, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, I don't love it? And conversely, was there anything you served up where people maybe were a bit apprehensive, but then went, oh my God, now you've done that with it, it's fantastic?
yeah, like nettles is always the obvious one. People just have this issue with them, and I can't really understand it. I think their depth of flavor is very, very good. They're quite earthy. Obviously they come with the risk of being stung, but if you combine them with other things, that sort of deep earthiness, that umami-ness works really, really well with mushrooms. So, quite often we'd be using those. I mean, I would say for the first couple of years, we'd have things like nettle spanakopita on the menu. We'd be using it for soups and, replacing spinach in anything that you'd think of that would have spinach in it, like gnocchi, or we did like nettle aloo a few times. That was always like a really easy one to demonstrate and a very responsible, easy one to gather as well, that we could use in a variety of different ways. I think as we sort of, ventured into more and more wild food, we definitely had things on the menu that I think, probably needed a little bit more attention than they did. So obviously fungus is something people want to sort of see, and quite a lot of them, obviously most fungi is like well over 90% water. So some of them are, not really great for sort of cooking quickly. You don't get the desired result as you would with a cep or even like button mushrooms, to be honest with you. So we learned a few routes to make those things a bit more interesting. But yeah, ultimately we really lent into the stuff that is abundant. And I still feel quite strongly about that. Like, I think there's no point me saying, here's something that you'll probably never, ever see and never get to cook with. I'd rather sort of show people that this is something that's really super interesting, super abundant and responsible to gather properly, and then make some really interesting items out of it, and combinations that sort of takes it away from being this sort of slightly difficult ingredient to work with. That's also why most people on menus will see, like, people have elderflower, samphire, sloes for the gin, or if you're into your mushrooms, everyone wants to find porcini, set, penny bun, just 3 different names there for the same fungus. The reason those are on menus so often is that they're quite easy to firstly identify. Secondly, they cook pretty well. They're kind of almost, I would say, near enough a perfect product. And then, there's also the issue, especially with fungi, of bugs and insects and things like that. So like porcini and rolls and others are quite well known as being insect repellent. So the main issue with fungus, as you saw when we had a walk the other day, is that there will definitely be, as soon as it's done its job, there will be various things that will be breaking that down, eating that mushroom, that if you were to cut it open before cooking it, you'd probably decide not to put it in the pan. So
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously the abundance of things that you might find when you're foraging, which is important. And I think from experience and anecdotally, I would say that I think maybe foraging is kind of growing in popularity and more people are doing it. But with that, do we need to be responsible with how we forage?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the main thing that I like to really teach, is sort of ethical foraging. I don't believe people should be simply told not to do it. People need to understand why and what it is that has a relationship with those plants. There's definitely things that are quite easy and responsible to gather, like I mentioned, nettles and various other things. But there obviously is that trend of commercial foraging, large groups going out and gathering in a way that I would imagine is not very responsible. You will see it like places like Epping Forest and New Forest will have rules and bylaws around gathering, because people have come in and basically just taken everything, like sweeps everything up off the forest floor. And I guess someone centrally has sorted it and then gone out and taken orders from restaurants or whatever. I'm the opposite from that. It's a difficult one because the word foraging sometimes has that negative connotation. I'd rather explain, here is this particular plant, or here is this particular fungus. Here is the way to think about how to gather it properly. Here's the risks you may have, but always have a view that there are many other things that may be relying on this, whether they're consuming it, living in it, around it, pollinating it, all that kind of stuff. So, when we see a big glut of things, I always have like a 1 in 25 kind of rule around how I gather and ways that I use it to make sure that it isn't something that I just, I imagine during wild garlic season, a lot of people go out and gather wild garlic and it maybe doesn't all get used. I have a sort of at least 5 different things that I'm always ready to do with a particular ingredient to create something different. That means that, I'm making the most of every ingredient whilst also being respectful and responsible around how I collect it.
Well, I think that's a really important point, because you don't just use it, like you said, with nettles. You've got various ways of treating them and using them, and ditto many of the other things you find that I think people might be surprised with. So aside from just kind of using it as a cooking ingredient, what are some of the other things that you do with what you find?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously medicines and pigments and all sorts of stuff that comes from things. So, I'm making, out of the green cones from various pines, I'm making a traditional throat soothing syrup that's done via fermentation of the young green cones. I also, I will dry them and powder them to use them in dishes, whether it's with sugar or salt. There's so many different things that you can sort of go out and gather things specifically for. And there's things like pine in particular. Now, these are huge trees. Quite a lot of them are a part of plantations as well. So, they're obviously just being cut down, and you can definitely make the most out of things like that. I also find that the word foraging, I think I apply to gardening because I grew up doing a lot of weeding. So I use things that, especially growing up, there's things that I would gather, like we had a Japanese quince that we'd always use to make various fruit butters. That fruit, I see it on the floor, on the front of people's houses because they like it as a decorative ornamental plant. Geum urbanum, the old clove root there, that's something I use as a spice. It's got the same oils as clove, unsurprisingly. So, three-cornered leek and invasive plants that people get in their front gardens, I also will happily there's a certain amount I can take, but like I will help clear certain areas and make use of these plants, and I might ferment them or, pickle the bulbs for various dishes, and just trying to make use with what we have around us, done in a responsible way. But, it does tie into medicine and things like that. Nettles can be made into, material. You can take the twine and that used to be used to make various materials historically. Dyes, teas, beers. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, and there's a certain irony, really, because you mentioned like the restaurant trade and professional foraging. And I think that a lot of people maybe do associate foraging with stuff that you might find, particularly in a high-end restaurant. But actually, given the cost of living crisis, isn't it something we probably need to really be doing a lot more of?
Yeah, I believe so. I think also, there's the other argument that, just simply getting outdoors and connecting with these plants and understanding your surroundings. I had a kid on a walk a few weeks back who recognized a tree because they had found it on Minecraft, which I kind of liked in a way. But, like they were quite intrigued by this tree and where it was. And, then we found Monk's Hood as well, which I'm sure of course. That was just a very, very interesting day. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think people should feel quite comfortable around gathering certain things, especially like nettles, as long as you know what you're doing, and identifying things properly. It's certainly, something that's abundant and will continue to grow no matter, if you're sort of taking it responsibly, top inch of the plants in spring and not when they're in seed in summer. Then you're generally, you got an abundant amount of complex vitamins and minerals there, and you spent, an hour outside doing it as well. So it's a good process.
Well, like you said as well, it might make us a little bit more relaxed in our gardening practices if we suddenly start recognising the weeds as things that we can eat. Yeah.
Sure.
So you also mentioned Epping Forest and New Forest. So is there like a rule of thumb when it comes to finding places that are good for foraging? And I'm thinking more kind of woodlands. Obviously, you've got the seashore and stuff, but is there any area you should particularly look out for?
I think, first of all, to check out that you're not doing it in a place you shouldn't be. So, signposts and bylaws, pretty important to check. You want to also try and check that it's not a polluted area. So, obviously, gathering things from busy roads is not a great idea. And then there's soil health as well. So I always talk about it, but there's a Victorian graveyard where there's loads of wild garlic, and I quite often see people picking the wild garlic there. And, obviously it is a graveyard. There's graves there that have lead lined. That's what they did in Victorian times and used arsenic to embalm. So soil health, checking the bylaws, there are specific sites where you definitely can't. You want to make sure you're not on a triple SI, so that's a site of specific scientific interest. And yeah, beyond that, I mean, that's just sort of my general prerequisites before I advise anyone go anywhere. You basically can't take any protected plants, so like orchids, fungi as well. That includes like reishi and lion's mane. And then like breaking the ground is a no-no. So I deter people from doing that generally anyway, because obviously that plant has many, many relationships going on under the ground and you're just feathering the whole thing. So I like to think about, gathering fruits and tops and, something that doesn't sort of take out an entire plant and the relationships that are going on. But for the most part, the rules of gathering are still pretty simple. If it grows above the ground and it's not protected, then you can gather. But the unwritten rules are that, only take what you need, be respectful, responsible, and obviously respect yourself, which kind of ties in with the pollution element and soil health element I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, definitely. So given that this episode is going to go out in August, is there anything that's going to come into season then, or is there anything you're particularly excited about at the moment picking?
Well, we've had a very, very sort of mild spring. We've had the pollination, has been incredible. There's not been a massive hold dip at any point. So we're just seeing a very big season for fruit at the moment. So anyone who takes a look around, especially say you're driving, you'll notice in the hedgerows that there'll be like yellow, red, purple plums all over the trees or on the floor. Those are the cherry plum, a species that was introduced in about the 16th century, and they are absolutely fruiting, going crazy. So it's something that you'll just find as soon as you spot a patch. There'll be loads on the floor that'll be absolutely perfect. They kind of drop off the tree as they become perfectly ripe, or you can take them off the tree, but they're an absolute, a huge amount of things that can be done with those. Whether you're making simple jams or spreads is quite nice. There's the process of salting them, Japanese process. So like ume, where you make umeboshi, is where you process those by salting them at 18% salt, the weight. And that's a lovely item that sort of takes a couple of sort of months to get to the final product. But that's really nice. I do quite a lot where, especially with fruits, where I'll just be infusing it into, either gin or making a syrup, and then using that in various ways, whether it's into cakes or having a second flavor layer on a kombucha or whatever it may be. It's just sort of get versatile with it. Obviously, blackberries are big as well. So we'll continue to see those fruiting all the way through until mid-September. So they will continue to fruit after, but you're not supposed to pick them after Michaelmas because, that's the time in the year where Lucifer was kicked out of heaven and landed in a blackberry bush and weed on them. And that's why they start going bad mid-September, basically. But yeah, those guys I love to pickle. I love to make a lovely sort of equal red wine and red wine vinegar pickling solution, which I'll bring to the boil and then drop a couple spices in and let it cool down. What that means is that I've made a pickling solution that I can pour over blackberries once I've come back from getting them. So yeah, my general process on blackberries is I get back, I make a jam, I make a cordial, I freeze some on a tray, and then pepper it into a bag once it's frozen. I'll make a pie mix, savory and sweet. And then once I'm kind of towards the end of my energy levels for doing that much prep, I'll just pour the pickling solution on top. And the result is something that you can then keep in a jar. I would say if you want it outside of the fridge, then use more vinegar than I suggested. But I tend to keep those in the fridge, and I use them to toss into dishes. Like I do a dish with couscous and coriander and lemon juice and olive oil. Toss it with blackberries, it's really great. Use it on desserts, pickled blackberries and a very rich chocolate brownie to cut through that sort of very richness is nice as well. So yeah, those are the two big ones you'll be seeing. Obviously, damsons will be a bit later than the cherry plums. So yeah, I imagine we're going to have a fairly significant fruit of those as well. Yeah, I think in general, basically the mildness of spring has the huge amount of pollination just means we're going to see lots and lots of fruit.
Yeah, excellent. Anyone listening to that cannot be failing to have their mouth watering at this point, I don't think. And if anyone does want to sample the delights that you whip up and join you on one of your walks, which I thoroughly recommend, where can they find you?
Yeah, my website is flavourfred.com, and I've got on there a selection of locations around the southeast where I run my walks. Or you can find me on Instagram at Flavour Fred. But yeah, you'll see on the Instagram, I do quite a lot of videos around sort of the things that are out and about. So yeah, reach out to me via the website or on Instagram and join me on a walk or take a look, ask me some questions.
Thank you, George, for the excellent conversation, and to you for listening. If you like this episode, I encourage you to listen to episode 32, Foraging with Michael Wachter, and episode 184, Forage for Mushrooms Without Dying. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.